So now we have a way for the users to register, log in and log out of our application. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at our database structure in terms of setting up our roles. So I've just got a picture here of a schematic that we're going to be using to visualize our database. So at the moment, the only thing we have in our database is our users table, and all the columns in here are just standard Laravel and Laravel Fortify columns. So we can leave them as they are. We don't need to make any changes to that. We do need to create two more tables, and one of them is going to be our roles table. And this is going to be a very simple table. It's only going to carry the name of the role. I'm going to throw the timestamps in there as well, but they're not needed. It's up to you whether you put them in or not. And this just allows us to give a name to the role. Now where the magic is going to happen is this link table here called role_user. And what this will do, this will allow us to link a user ID to a role ID. In fact, it'll actually allow us to link multiple user IDs to multiple roles. Now this is something people have asked me from my previous series. Why do I do a many-to-many relationship here instead of a one-to-many? Now a one-to-many would usually mean on the users table there would be a column called role_ID, and then that links that one user to one of the roles. And then them roles in return could belong to many users. So you could have many admins, for example. Now this can work for a lot of systems, but you lose a lot of flexibility in doing this because your users can only have one role. So imagine if you had an e-commerce store, for example, and you had things like admins, customer service, and sales reps. Then maybe at a later date you want to add a new feature, such as technical support questions. So when a customer asks a question, you want only your trained staff to be able to reply to that. So to do that, you'd have to create a new role called technical support, for example. And then in a one-to-many situation, you would then need to go through your entire application and allow that tech support role other permissions, like maybe adding a product, for example. Whereas if we do it with a many-to-many, the user can have multiple roles. So they might already have a role of customer support, which might allow them to email customers. But then you can also give them that tech support role so they can reply to customers' technical questions. So that just gives you much more flexibility as the application grows. So that is why I always do a many-to-many role in this situation. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is generate our roles model. And we're also going to be generating a migration, seeder, factory, and a resource controller with this model. And we can do that all in one artisan command. PHP artisan make :model. Then we're going to give this model a name of role. And then after this, we're going to pass in the A flag. So we're going to do an -A, and that'll generate all of our extra files that we need for this. And you can see there in the output, it's created us the model, the factory, the migration, the seeder, and a controller. Let's jump into the migration. So it's under database, migrations, and then it'll be the bottom migration there, create roles table. And down in the up method, the only column we need to add is a string for the name. So we can do a table and then say we want a string, and we want to give this string the name of name. And this allows us to apply a name to each of our roles. And that's all we need for that table. That's pretty simple. Now the next thing we want to do is create our link table. And this allows us to link our roles to our models in a many-to-many relationship. So back over in our terminal, we can do a PHP artisan, and we want to make :migration. And then we want to call this migration create_role_user_table. Now this is the Laravel naming convention when you're creating many-to-many relationships. It takes the singular name of the two tables in alphabetical order. So in our case, it's role first and then user. I'll just hit enter on this. Now again, over in our editor, let's open up this new migration. You can see here in the up method, Laravel has worked out we want to call this role_user. So the only columns we need to create on this role user link table is two unsigned IDs, one that links to the role user ID and one that links to the user ID. Now because we're going to be adding foreign keys onto this, we need to make sure they are the same column type as the ID on the user and the roles table. So as you can see in this migration here, and it's the same for all of Laravel migrations, it uses this ID helper method here. Let's take a look at this. And this is over in Illuminate Database Schema Blueprint, in case your IDE doesn't have point and click. And you can see here, this is creating a big increments. Now, if we just go and take a look at that, this is calling unsigned big integer. And in turn, this is calling big integer. As you can see here, this is creating an 8-byte integer. And we're also passing in unsigned, so it's going to create unsigned big integer. So when we're creating our link table, we need to make sure that our 2 columns linking to user ID and role ID are both unsigned big integers. So let's add these in now, and we want to create an unsigned big integer. We want to give this a name of role_ID, and that is what's going to reference the role ID on the roles table. And we can just copy this line down because it's the same for the user ID, but obviously we need to change the column name to user ID. So I'm just going to copy that down. And instead of role ID, this one is going to reference the user ID, and this one's going to reference the ID on the user table. And we're naming these columns in this way so that Laravel Eloquent can understand what table we're linking this ID to. So that's actually all we need in terms of columns on this role user table. And this would actually work now if we left it just as it is. Laravel could work that out. But for the purpose of data integrity in our database, we're going to add some foreign key constraints. And this ensures data between this link table and the other tables, in our case role and user, stays consistent. So for example, if we deleted a user, the database engine, whatever that is that we've chosen, MySQL in my case, will then delete all the entries from the role_users table. So there won't be loads of IDs in there for a user that doesn't exist anymore. So still inside of this create method, we're just going to call table, and we're going to create a foreign key. So we can just call the foreign method, and we want to create a foreign key on the column role_ID, which is this column up here that we've just created. And then we want to let it know what column this references. So we can call a method called references. And we want to say this references the ID column. So we're saying it's going to reference the ID column on the roles table. So let's just do that now. So we call the on method, and we're going to reference our roles table. So we're saying this role ID here, it references the ID on the roles table. So that's how the database engine knows that this column here is linked to our ID on our roles table. And then finally, we want to add on the end another method called onDelete. And here we want to call cascade. So we're telling the database engine when we delete a user, for example, we want that delete to cascade down into this role user table and then delete all of the rows where it has that same user ID. So that just means if a user is deleted, this role user table isn't full of IDs for users that no longer exist. So it just keeps the database nice and tidy. So we're going to do the same again for the user ID. So I can just copy this line down. Instead of role ID, we want the user ID. And that's going to reference the ID column on the users table. And then we will keep the onDelete cascade method there. So let's try and run this now. We can do a PHP artisan migrate. And you can see now that has run the migration for us for the role user table and the roles table. Now, if you're wondering why it's run all my migrations again here, because it probably hasn't for you, that is just because I've reset the database before I started recording this section of the video. So you'll probably only see these ones here, but mine has run all of my migrations on this, as you can see from this output. Okay, so that works perfectly well, but there is another way that we can create these foreign key columns, which is a little bit shorter in code, but it's not as verbose. So I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to leave it up to you to decide what you think is the best one to go with. So for now, I'm just going to do a PHP artisan migrate rollback, and that'll just undo the migrations for us so we can rerun them in a moment after we've tried this new method. Okay, so instead of calling these foreign keys and these unsigned big integers here, I'm just going to comment these out. I'll leave them in the code, so when you download the code at a later date, these are still here if you want that option. So again, calling the table, instead of calling unsigned big integer, we can actually call a method called foreign ID. And what this does is it creates the unsigned big integer column for us, but also sets up a foreign key relationship as well at the same time. So we can say foreign ID, and we can give this a name of role_ID like we did above. and we can say we want this to be constrained, and then again on delete we want this to cascade, and then that's it. So instead of writing this line here and then this line here, we can do it all in one go here. Now I'm just going to copy this down again and then obviously change from role to user ID. So those two lines replace these 4 commented out lines. Now it's up to you which one you go with. They're both going to work in exactly the same way. It's just whichever method you like the look of best. So back over in the terminal, I'm just going to rerun this migration. And you can see there it's created the tables in exactly the same way. Just a word of note here, we're creating the foreign IDs in the actual creation of the table. And that's because we planned ahead and thought what we're going to need for our database schema. But there can be times arise where you want to add a foreign key constraint at a later point. So you might do this in a separate migration file. So you'd have a migration file with just the foreign IDs being added onto the table. And if you are doing that, you'll need to update your down method to delete these foreign keys. And I'll show you how to do that just in case it is something you need to do later on as you develop this user management system further. So you don't need to do this, and you can skip past this if you want, but it's a good thing to learn for when you're creating tables via migrations. So in the down method, we just call schema on the table, and we want to call it on the role_user table. And then as a second parameter here, we can pass in a closure or function. And we want to pass in blueprint as table into here. And then inside of here, we can call table. And we want to drop the foreign key relationship that has been named role_user_role_ID_foreign. And at the end of here, we just put them a semicolon. So when Laravel creates a foreign key relationship, it's got a convention. How it does it is, it does the table name first, and then an underscore, and then the column that it's creating the foreign key for, and then finally _foreign on the end. So let's just duplicate this line down, and then for the user ID, it's on the role user table, and it's _user_ID_foreign. And then that's all you need to do to get rid of the foreign keys when you're reversing a migration. Now, because we're actually creating the foreign keys when we create the table, we don't actually need this, because in the down method, we actually just delete the whole table, and that takes the foreign keys with it. So this is just there if you're putting your foreign key constraints in a separate migration. So finally, now we have the database structure in place, we need to let our models know about the belongs to many relationship. So Laravel Eloquent understands how it can get the data from the database. So over in the root of our project, if we come to app models, and we'll go into our role model first, you can see at the moment this is empty. So we're just going to create a new public function, and we're going to give this a name of users. And inside of here, we can just simply do a return. We're going to return this, and we're going to call belongs to many. And then we just need to let it know what it belongs to. And it belongs to app/models/user. So here we're just letting Laravel Eloquent know if we call the users method that we just created on the role model, then it needs to look at the app models user to work out the belongs to many relationship. Now we can just do the exact same thing but in reverse for the users model. So I'm just going to copy this and then open up our user model this time. You can see there's a bit more in this to begin with, but don't worry about that. We just come down here. And then instead of calling this users, we call this roles. And this belongs to many app models role. And then that's it. That's all we need to do to set up our relationships. So Laravel now knows that there is a many-to-many relationship between roles and users. And we set our database up in such a way that Laravel can understand that relationship and get the data out. So don't forget to hit that like button if you like this video, and also don't forget to subscribe so you get future notifications from my videos. I'm also over on Twitter at pdigitaluk if you want to follow me. I'll also be posting updates on my Twitter feed for upcoming videos. And also, if you found this video useful and you'd like to help me out and buy me a coffee, I also have a Patreon, the link's in the description. And any donations you could make are much appreciated to help me to continue producing these videos.